Larry Blake is a supervising sound editor and re-recording mixer and has mixed over 65 feature films since 1989. Included in this number are 31 features and 3 television seasons with Steven Soderbergh, plus multiple films from David Gordon Green, Victor Nunez, and the Duplass brothers. He has written extensively on film sound and will be publishing the autobiography of film sound great Murray Spivak, The Sounds of My Life, in addition to separate anthologies of his columns and feature articles. First up is a book he's writing on motion picture archiving, Solving the Digital Dilemma. He is native to and a current resident of New Orleans. Please join me in welcoming Larry Blake.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here. So we can have these slides up here. This is really dramatic curtain. If I get hit, there's no understudy. These two people are responsible for the sound of King Kong. Any casual movie lover knows Max Steiner, but Murray Spivak remains something of a mystery outsider. Yet, if today's rules had been in place since the 40s, Murray would have won 12 Oscars, more than anyone not named Walt Disney. Instead, he only had one statuette, the one he received for Best Sound in 1969 for Hello, Dolly. I think he led one of the great lives in a world of arts in the 20th century in both music and movies. I first met Murray in 1979, and in 1985 I did a 36-hour oral history with him. Originally, the idea was to turn the tapes over to the Academy, but I realized that given the life he had, it deserved much more. So from 1992 until his death in 1994, I worked with him in converting it into a first-person autobiography, which I hope to finally publish sometime next year. His movie career spanned from silence in the early 20s until his retirement in 1973, with a string of some of the biggest and most loved movies of that period. When you see the life he led, you'll see why I'm not only honored to be the custodian of his legacy, but also being able to present it to you here tonight. His parents were born in Odessa in Ukraine, although Murray was born in the US in 1903. At an early age, is this thing cutting out? Sorry. Okay. I'm a sound guy, I wouldn't know these things. At an early age, he acquired a love of music, piano initially, and then focusing on percussion. Bumbunik was a derogatory Yiddish phrase for drummers, and I asked Murray why there was this phrase, and he said, because most drummers are bums. Here's a snare drum case of his that I was able to snag about 90 years after his drumming career ended. I got in LA, and it made the trip over 90 years from New York. Murray's work started in bands in his teens, in places such as the Arcadia Ballroom, and at the age of 21, he would open up a drum school in New York. He became known as one of the 4 horsemen in percussion in New York, along with Dave Gusikoff, Carl Glassman, and the famous Billy Gladstone. You can see the range of instruments he played, including the recently developed vibraphones. I also knew his drum stands. Murray initially used chairs. He worked in orchestras at the peak of silent movies in the 20s, in such places as the Strand Theater, both for the large pre-shows and in a pit during parts of the movies. Can you imagine a program like this today at a local multiplex? This was his live career, and his work in recordings began in the acoustic era when they would plow play into a horn. Electrical recording didn't begin until 1925. He then started to play for early sound movies, as was the case with his work in silence. Because he was a percussionist, he was often called upon to do sound effects. One of the places he worked at was RKO Pathé Studios in New York, and this led to his getting a contract to go to LA and create its sound effects department. In this period, in the late 20s, he was making about $750 a week. He couldn't spend any money because he had drumsticks in his hands from 8 a.m. to 1 a.m., 7 days a week. When he moved out to LA in 1929, he had $85,000 in the bank. He only found out 50 years later that he had possibly the first contract signed to RKO. Initially, it was only for 6 months. His good fortune continued at RKO. He was making between working as the head of the sound effects department and the head of the music business department $500 a week. This was fortunate because he lost all of his savings in the stock market crash 7 months after he got to Los Angeles, losing the equivalent in 2022 dollars of $1.3 million. Here's the view that Murray had when coming into RKO in April 1929. He had a vivid memory 60 years later of walking past those rose bushes. Just outside the picture on the right was RKO Stage 2, its current Paramount Stage 24, which we'll see soon. Both because recording was cumbersome, requiring a large truck like this, and because sound effects initially had to be sometimes performed during shooting, Murray set out initially to create a range of sound effects machines. There's a through line here from doing them in the orchestra to accompany silent movies, to playing in scores for early sound movies in New York, and then to doing the effects live on the set during shooting in LA, and then finally editing them as film. Here's a wind machine that he made. They would put silk over it to varying degrees to change the texture of it. And here's a rain machine. And both of these were used on the set of movies like Seven Keys to Baldpate in 1929. Sometimes Murray would be called upon to create sounds outside the realm of see a dog, hear a dog. Here in What Price Hollywood in 1932, Murray needed to create the sound of what he called a brainstorm. The famous Slavo Vorkovich did that montage, and Murray created the sound with a bunch of rubber bands and stretched them over a frame of a square box. It was a clever, simple touch. I don't know if you could hear, where there was a dial tone at beginning and end, sort of what film school students would call a diegetic sound. Sometimes Murray was able to call directly upon his musical abilities, as in the scene from the 1930 Wheeler and Woolsey comedy, Half Shot at Sunrise, for which he built a xylophone from steel pipes.
We'll cuddle close until the break of day, where things are blue away.
As you saw in New York, he had played xylophones and vibraphones there. His collaboration with Max Steiner was such that Max would even compose music sometimes to match Murray's sound effects, as was the case with the whistles in Melody Cruise. However important Max and Murray were to Kong, they were George and Ringo, and we still needed to get a John and Paul. Here at the top, we have Fay Wray, the actress. At the right is co-director Ernest Schoedsack. On the left, playing the role of John, is Marion Cooper. And at the bottom, essaying the role of Paul, is visual effects genius Willis O'Brien. For Kong to succeed, it required a perfect merger of stories that Cooper had wanted to tell and the visual effects artistry of O'Brien. Cooper and Schoedsack were quite characters. Here they are as the pilots in the last scene, of course, of Kong, and their phrase was, "Let's kill the son of a bitch ourselves." And if you saw the call sheet up there, it required 2 bit men, which Cooper and Schoedsack played. Cooper had flown in World War I, and dilettantes these guys were not. The tiger footage from Chang was shot by Schoedsack himself. And much of this footage is from the great documentary that Peter Jackson did, which is in the 2005 issue of Kong. We can see pre-echoes of Kong in locations and shots. O'Brien's work goes back to primitive but very clever work he did in 1917 for Edison, where you see dinosaurs, and then a first gorilla, and then in a 1925 film, The Lost World, where you can see signs of the Tyrannosaurus Rex and dinosaur fights to come. But the crucial last step before Kong was the abandoned RKO film, Creation. Only 4 minutes of this remain extant. This was shot in 1931. Knowing Kong, you can see how much improvement was made in the next year. And I'll spare you the scene of the baby Triceratops being shot in the eye. In his great bio of Merian Cooper, Mark Cadavaz quotes him as saying that Cooper and Shozak's credo was distant, difficult, and dangerous. With Kong, dangerous, no, not like Chang. Distant, well, would you believe Culver City on the same lot where I was featured in Airplane? I'll be signing autographs later. Witness this shot. It's crazy enough what we see, but to have the creature crawling up a rope, which is then cut, and then the camera panning up to everything else, it does everything in the same frame, which is really sort of the key thing in any great visual effects shot, is that you believe it, even if they have to go to extra difficult lengths. So Kong is primarily famous for its stop motion animation, and of course it is amazing at that, but it really does have the full suite of visual effects. If you look at it and you study it, there's so many good books about it. It's really quite astonishing. Like everyone else, Murray started work on King Kong before Kong was Kong. As a research for Creation, he wrote to museums asking them for clues to what they would sound like, what the monsters would sound like. Now, if you read this thing up here, this is an example of someone who uses 200 words when 10 would do. Reading it, Murray didn't know whether the guy was pulling his leg or trying to teach him English. I mean, he could have just said, maybe they hissed, I don't know. But he had to get a little more flowery with this. So Murray just resorted to his own instincts and just did what felt right. So when Creation's budget started to hang a left to Heaven's Gate, Selznick and Cooper, both then at RKO, pulled the plug and started developing a movie starring a giant terror gorilla. That's what it was called in the first memo. If you read this memo, it's just really too good. If you look at the breakdown near materials, gorilla, $50. I think this is really the sound effects equivalent of buying Apple at $5. We don't know if the T-Rex was thrown in because he's not listed, as we say in Louisiana, as lagniappe. Work began on Kong in December 1931 with the script. It's amazing that it was finished 14 months later in spite of the crazy time it took to do the stop motion animation. Here's Murray spotting notes for everything, and one thing you don't see is the elevated train sequence, which was added late in the game and was still being shot a month before the film opened, March 2nd, 1933. You can see this call sheet for January 31st, 33. So in doing the sound effects, Murray did a combination of what we would call today Foley, what he wouldn't have called it then, effects that he played, and stuff with very speeding other elements. Here the footsteps, although in the final tally gravel was added. And the person being hit on with the Lambsville bass drum beater is Walter Elliott, who was Murray's assistant, and 30 years later, he would win the first Best Sound Editing Oscar, which had previously been part of the Best Special Effects. In Elliott's AFI oral history, he never mentions Murray by name, only refers to a drummer, and he makes it seem as if he did Kong, but was very vague about how he did it, how it was done, and people much more objective about Murray than I am agree with me that Murray was the guy. Kong might be the first movie to have extensive publicity about the sound effects work. Among the gems discovered in his articles, that 3/4 of the effects machines that we saw Murray had made when he got to RKO 4 years earlier had been destroyed because of more location recording, but even still, the inaugural was decades away. The previous pictures have been well circulated, but here are some that are sort of rare. The Triceratops with a gourd and bellows and megaphones for breathing and gurgles. One animal that's left on the jungle room cutting floor is the Arsenotherium, which is mentioned throughout the budget and in Murray's spotting notes. And indeed, he made a point of telling me that he used a Vox Humana pipe to create it. Let's hear what Murray has to say about what is in the movie.
I conceived of one idea which helped me tremendously in all of these sounds for the animal noises. I went to the Selig Zoo at the time, which we had out here, and I got all the roars I needed. I then slowed those down to half speed, and I played the tiger growl backwards against the lion roar forward, and it gave me a sort of an uncanny roar.
It's pretty amazing. The T-Rex was partly Murray's voice, also slowed down, plus a puma. Murray had recorded a tree in the Sequoia National Park, thinking that all the racket that the monsters make, that he would need them, but he didn't use it for that. He ended up using it for when T-Rex's jaw is broken. The slowing down of sound effects helped Murray do two things. One is he needed stuff longer, and he also needed it to get out of the human range. Here's Murray's sound effects book from RKO, which is appropriately now owned by Ben Burtt. And you see how stuff was libraryized, whether it was or was not in the movie. And then at the bottom of this page, you see this entry for Kong's love notes, which are better known as his love grunts.
I had a very large megaphone, and I just started and I went,
The article above said that what led Murray to do this was in spite of not even a wild animal makes love by groaning and hissing. Speak for yourself, pal. I'll never forget sitting at Murray's dining room table and hearing him do this. This is a 3-sound, 1-picture moviola that was built for Kong. Murray had told me of this, but he said it in the context of cutting from musicals where you'd have one vocal track, an orchestra track, and a taps track. But indeed, according to the article accompanying this, it was first used for Kong. And of course, later on, a similar thing was used to cut I Love Lucy shows with 3-picture and 1 soundtrack. A maximum of 4 tracks could be mixed together at one time with Kong, whether it's components of the creature work or the final mix, that was it. I feel fairly certain this is close to the console that Kong was mixed on. Consoles should really almost be put in quotes. Telling a re-recording mixer today that a classic film could be mixed with something like this, like telling an aeronautical engineer that you can do the Apollo mission with just the power of an iPhone. This brings up an important question about the introduction of re-recording versus only using what was recorded during shooting. No one person or studio invented it, and all did it to different degrees starting around 1928. Warner even did it with Vitaphone movies using a big contraption called the bull wheel. But just like no one person invented the microphone boom, and Jack Foley didn't invent Foley, it was in fact in the first real sound feature, Don Juan, in 1926, and was recorded at the same time as the music. I only just found out that some movies were hybrids. Original production sound was cut into the release printing negative with re-recorded negative. And it's horrifying to think as a sound guy that you would see an answer print and you'd have to give timing notes like, the scene at 685 feet, could you make that 2 points louder? You know, it's just so abstract. For some perspective, here is the steps that they went through in doing Kong. It ended up being, for most of the sound effect scenes, and certainly the busy sound effect scenes, 10 generations. He'd record something, which is onto an optical negative, make a print, and then Murray would slow it down or speed up that print and re-record that. That was then cut against picture. And then if that was the lion or tiger, you'd have lion, tiger, and maybe breathing. That's Kong, and that's 4 tracks. You mix that down. And then you might have the T-Rex with another couple of tracks. You mix that down. And then if that gets above 2, you've got to mix it down even further. So you end up with maximum of 2 effects tracks, leaving 1 open for dialogue and 1 open for music. It's really quite astonishing that it sounded as good as it did. This is some basic perspective here. Remember, electrical recording was only invented 8 years before Kong came out. So let's jump forward in history and see how that number 4 stayed around. The Beatles did the bulk of their classic work on 4-track decks, bouncing from one to the other. Ben Burtt changed film sound forever with his work on Star Wars in 1977. And in spite of being 44 years after Kong, he was still working with the basic sound design canvas of 4 tracks. In fact, The Next Leap after Kong in sound effects design is generally considered to be the forbidden planet by Louis and B.B. Barron in the 50s. They were hired to do the sound and ended up being both doing sound effects and music. The history of blending in music and sound effects is also a subject that needs much discussion. Whereas in Kong, they worked well together, they were never confused with each other. Probably a great example of them working together recently was the TV miniseries Chernobyl. Max Steiner came to LA from Austria via New York, where he'd worked in various capacities in Broadway. He came out to LA in 1929 and soon found his calling in film scoring. Here he appears in the movie Half Naked Truth. Kong is sometimes erroneously referred to as a first full score. It certainly isn't. One contender, and I never liked playing championship calendar, is Steiner's Symphony of 6 Million. This image, by the way, is from publicity. It's not in the movie itself. Soon after that, he also did a score for Bird of Paradise. And this is a cigarette case, or maybe it's a case for cards that says Bird of Paradise, Max, thank God. That he gave Murray. What is literally first, academics can fight over, but Kong is, if not the first complete score, it's unquestionably one of the first great scores. Here's the main title cue for it. And he did all of his work in Kong in approximately 8 weeks. Now, many of you have seen the More Cowbell skit on Saturday Night Live. Well, among Murray's firsts in his career, he had many of them, 67 years earlier. So right here is Louise Close, and you see a microphone next to Louise Close. The reason why that microphone is there, because Max kept asking for louder and louder harp. So finally, in one take, Murray recorded just the harp with orchestra accompaniment. He turned off all the other microphones. And when he played it back for Steiner, Steiner said, maybe it's a bit too much, and Murray got all mad with him. If you followed the line back there from the podium, when you get to the control room, there was glass there looking out like a standard music recording studio. And that had the small mixer, and the monitor was behind it. That was also the room where the film was mixed, which is just insane to think of a little cubicle with a piece of glass in front of you and the speaker there, but that's the way it was. Contrary to popular assumption, Murray didn't mix or record Kong, but he was, of course, very involved. This page appeared in the program for Kong, and much has been said about their collaboration, and a large percentage of it is conjecture. Murray's discussions with Steiner about where music would prevail, which is a favorite verb of Murray's that I loved, and where the sound effects would, and where they would make room for each other. But I don't believe, as some have said, that they would split the frequencies up as some part of a design, or that Murray tuned the dinosaurs to the music. It just wasn't practical. If you go back to the chart I had of the steps, because you couldn't shift pitch without losing sync. That could only happen later on. He did pitch airplanes, as he did here in Flying Down to Rio, and probably did the same for King Kong. Murray was the head of the music business department, and he often had to run interference for Max. Here's Max's response to a $337 overage on Gay Divorcee. I resent this as a slur on my unimpeachable integrity for the last 5 years. He can easily offset the overage by cutting the continental number out entirely. Well, if you know that movie, that really couldn't happen. Steiner was constantly complaining about how hard he was working and wrote letters to executives at RKO, and Murray's attempt at damage control ended up hurting himself. Murray was effectively fired from RKO in late 1934 due to his getting in the middle of a dispute on behalf of Max. Murray then did spotty jobs at Republic and Fox Studios and even moved back east to be a drummer again, but came back to work completely broke in 1937 at 20th Century Fox. He was then making $100 a week. By the way, the May company that Steiner referred to is this building downtown. It's not the building right here because that wasn't built until 1939. Murray is second from left, and with the white shirt is Roger Heeman, who was the lead re-recording mixer at Fox throughout all that time. His son mixed the Jaws movie in 1975. Heeman's clout was such that he reported directly to Darryl Zanuck. Murray similarly recorded to Fox music director Alfred Newman. Oh, sorry, wrong one. So. Brothers Lionel and Emil were noted composers, as are his sons David and Tom. Irving, Randy Newman's father, was Murray's doctor. Initially, Murray did music recording along with someone who deserves a special mention here, Vinton Vernon. Here are excerpts of 2 recordings that were made by the Fox Music Department for Alfred Newman. Murray and Vinton are mentioned.
While Charlie was giving an upbeat, and Vinny kept saying, step closer to the mic, closer to the mic. Maury kept yelling, get farther from the mic, farther from the mic. Carol was screaming, what number?
Rick, get Rax and Bradshaw in to pack. Do it with a click.
Get Arthur Morton, Arthur Lang, and send out for the Swami.
Get every goddamn son of a bitch that isn't in the army.
Get Vinnie Vernon, Murray Spivak, early in the morning.
And keep 'em late in case we get a playback without warning.
Get Cliff and Bob and Earl and Carol, Gal and all the others.
Here is part of Murray's collection of acetates that he owned and which I bought from him. Most of these were for distribution, but it's important to note that this type of discs here, they were used for immediate playback on the stage because, of course, you're recording the optical film, you can't play it back. And discs were also used even as far as the 60s for playback on the set. At that point, you still had the cameras, recorders, and a playback turntable locked together. Once things got a little bit more portable with Crystal Sync and Nagras, then that ended in the late 60s. Murray later used his percussion skills for the African dance number in the Fox film Stormy Weather, when Bill Robinson danced on plywood boards during production. Murray transcribed the taps into musical notation, and then he played them on 3 tom-toms. Cost to Fox, $250. Very soon, Murray began his career as re-recording mixer while continuing to record music. Note that this console was in use till around 1953, 12 inputs for all dialogue music and sound effects, up from 4 from Kong. Matters changed with stereo, but not much. This is almost identical, by the way, in some design factors to the console that mixed Star Wars in 1977. Stuff really didn't change in console design until the late 80s. Note the introduction of sliding faders handling 3 at a time, which was basically for the Fakata Fox stereo production recording technique. You can see here where they would have 3 space microphones recording dialogue. It was insane. You could see if the actor turned a few inches or if the microphone moved a few inches, the voice would jump radically from speaker to speaker. Drove Murray crazy. CinemaScope was very LCR-centric, and surrounds were pretty much an afterthought. Indeed, Murray remained throughout his whole career very conservative about surrounds. Murray was at the creation of CinemaScope 4-track magnetic sound in '53, and 2 years later for the Taddeo 70mm 6-track format. In January 1955, he became an independent mixer, which was unheard of in those days. The last 15 years proper of his career fit right within the heyday of 70mm roadshow movies. As much as his 4-track stereo work in Fox was fantastic, he found out that he could switch, he could go to 11, let's say, because he really loved the 5-screen channel format that Taddeo offered. This was at MGM, which is now the Sony Cary Grant Theater. There's Joe Kane, the production mixer, who also mixed Oklahoma, Fred Hines, and Murray. Point to note here is that Murray never, ever punched in on stereo movies. They would rehearse and then go pop to pop. Insert starts and splicing masters were sometimes used. And indeed, here's a card from a reel of Oklahoma. Here's Murray in the mid-'60s. Note that only 3 places in the U.S. could mix 6-track at that point: MGM, Fox, and Taddeo. This happened until the late 70s. Here's Saul Chaplin, Christopher Plummer, Julie Andrews, Robert Wise, and Murray during the recording of songs for The Sound of Music. And note the chops that Murray and Vinton Vernon, the conductors in the orchestra, had. They recorded live to one piece of 6-track mag film. Vocals were done simultaneously live to a separate recorder. Throughout this period, Murray was very insistent on going the minimum number of generations he could. And indeed, what you would hear at the Fox Scotia Theater was only 2 generations removed from the recording done in that room. Now back to Murray and the Oscars. Boldface shows his Oscar winners, and until 1969, Murray was never named on the statuettes nor never went on stage. Two of these movies, West Side Story and Sound of Music, were directed by Robert Wise. And when his movie The Sand Pebbles was nominated, he wanted to be sure that if it won, Murray would go on stage. So this is the letter he wrote to the Academy, which was really a pivot point in the history of Oscars for sound. This was not his first battle along these lines. 3 years earlier, he had to fight to get Boris Levin, the great art director, sole credit on The Sound of Music, and not have the name of the production design department head at Fox, who had contributed nothing to the film, appear on screen. I'd often wondered what happened with Murray's Oscar for Hello, Dolly after he died, and was thrilled to see that it had been hiding in plain sight a few feet away from me in a special collections room at the Herrick Library. Babe Ruth is often thought of as a great slugger, but in fact, his first fame was as a picture. Similarly, Murray was the first badass sound effects editor, and then a top-notch scoring mixer, and then a re-recording mixer. Effects editing and re-recording, there are many people do that today, but scoring and re-recording at a top level, I think, is a province of only two people in the history of film sound, Murray and Danny Wallen, who recorded hundreds of film scores and did the landmark music mixes on both Woodstock and Nashville. But Murray did all three, so I equate him more with Jim Thorpe, who excelled in multiple sports, won the pentathlon and the decathlon in the same Olympics. Murray was also world-class in the music field, both in his beginning days and then also later as a drum teacher. First in New York, remember, in 1924, and he did it for perhaps 75 consecutive years. And that's really quite astonishing. He did it until right before he passed away in 1994. And in the world of percussion, Murray is something of a god for his technique. Here's a list of some of his best-known students. When he moved to LA, he continued initially to keep his hands in shape. And Louis Bellson's probably his best-known student. Duke Ellington called Belson not only the best drummer, but one of the best musicians in the world. And Belson always gave credit to Murray for his lessons. They made an instructional video in 1992.
To play drums correctly requires not only patience, but a good teacher. The student needs guidance in order to be able to play the various required rudiments, their application to all types of music, and the ability to read music. I believe in reaching the student's brain and let his brain dictate to his hands. The brain and hands have to coordinate as a single unit in order to attain perfection. I prefer teaching the instrument and let the student select his own development as far as technique and style is concerned. I don't teach style. Style is up to the individual.
This is Murray around the time I was working with him on the book. This is actually the official Academy portrait for their oral history with him. And I was able, in 1993, to take him to a screening of a movie I'd worked on, King of the Hill. The score was by Cliff Martinez, whom had taken lessons with him. And Murray first commented to me when we went out of the screening room, "The car went right past him. Why the hell was it so low?" And it doesn't freeze frame in the movie. Of course, Murray was right. The best showing ever of Kong was in an RKO screening room when Murray, Max, O'Brien, and Cooper approved the answer print from the original camera negative. Seeing that very print would be the best thing for us to screen tonight. And indeed, the Geffen is one of about 7 theaters in the US that meets the fire safety code standards and can project nitrate film. But not only does it not exist, there's no print of that original version. And the camera negative and the fine grain masters are all gone. All extant film prints of Kong have various degrees of imperfections. And when you list everything here, sort of any one of them is a deal breaker. But then you have stuff like the missing frames replaced by nearby frames, and that was very evident when Kong falls, spoiler alert, Kong falls off the Empire State Building, and instead of smoothly falling, he would bump, not at the observation towers where he should have bumped, but he would stagger as he went down because they would take, if they were missing some frames, they would take 2 nearby frames, copy them, which of course means negative to positive, back to negative, or positive, you see what I'm going there, and cut them in. So for a couple of frames, it'd be 2 generations down, but repeated. And everything here is common to a lot of restorations that are done for movies made in the optical era and in the less modern era. So, as a result, Warner Brothers scoured the world, and in 2005, they found these 3 elements, which were best. The last one they didn't use. It had a lot of water damage. They scanned them in 4K and did months of work using modern digital timing at Warner Bros. MPI. And then they created a seamless master using tools to make minute shot-to-shot and frame-to-frame density and grain corrections. This was by Ray Grabowski there. Again, the goal is to match the picture and sound experience of that screening room at Melrose and Gower as closely as possible. So I know many of you are expecting a 35mm print to relive that experience. I do believe that this DCP is without question the closest we'll ever get to that screening room or to Radio City Music Hall on March 2nd, 1933. I'll be around if you have questions, and I can be reached here. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Kong, the first love child of the music, sound effects, and visual effects worlds. Thanks for listening.